8-year-old Larry witnessed his world crumble without a single crash. No thunderous arguments echoed through the hallways. No dishes shattered against kitchen walls. No dramatic scenes marked the dissolution of his family unit. Instead, what haunted him was something far more unsettling. The profound silence that had settled between his parents like an invisible wall. That evening, as he sat at the familiar dining table, Larry traced meaningless patterns on his plate with a fork, his small ears tuned to the careful, measured exchanges between his mother and father. These weren't the heated discussions of before, those had at least carried passion, even if it was angry passion. This new dynamic was something entirely different, a cold politeness that felt like death by 1,000 paper cuts. Even at his tender age, Larry possessed an intuitive understanding that the absence of conflict didn't signify peace. It signified something far more ominous, emotional distance that seemed to stretch wider with each passing day. When the inevitable announcement finally came, "We're going to be living in different houses," Larry's universe shifted on its axis. He nodded with the solemnity of someone much older, pretending to comprehend how two people who had once promised forever could suddenly rewrite their story into separate chapters. But Larry represents far more than just one confused child. He embodies millions of young souls worldwide who navigate the complex emotional terrain of parental separation each year. While the specific circumstances surrounding each divorce may vary dramatically, the internal landscape of a child experiencing this upheaval follows remarkably consistent patterns, emotional reverberations, unspoken questions, and silent battles that rage within developing hearts and minds. The psychological impact of divorce on children extends far beyond simple statistics about broken homes. It's an intricate tapestry woven from strands of resilience and confusion, longing and adaptation, creating an entirely unique worldview that will influence every relationship they form throughout their lives. Research in developmental psychology has illuminated the profound ways divorce affects children's emotional development. Studies consistently show that children from divorced families demonstrate higher rates of anxiety, insecurity, and what psychologists term divided loyalty syndrome. These clinical findings barely scratch the surface of the lived experience. The racing heartbeat of a child lying awake at night, wondering whether they'll be forced to choose sides or whether love itself comes with an expiration date. Picture Larry on a Friday evening, methodically packing his school backpack for another weekend at his father's house. Within that small canvas container lies much more than homework assignments and a toothbrush. It carries the invisible burden of existing simultaneously in two worlds that rarely intersect, creating a constant state of emotional code switching that would challenge even the most adaptable adult. Should he mention to his father that his mother bought him a new sweater? Should he tell his mother about the special pancakes his father made for breakfast? At such a young age, Larry is already learning the exhausting art of self-editing, filtering his natural joy and excitement to prevent it from becoming someone else's source of pain. This internal negotiation represents what psychologists identify as loyalty conflict, the psychological tug-of-war between wanting to love both parents freely, while simultaneously fearing that showing affection to one might somehow betray or hurt the other. Children rarely articulate these feelings directly. Instead, they carry this emotional weight like a secret burden pressing against their small shoulders, shaping their behavior in ways they don't yet understand. As Larry matured into adolescence, he developed an almost supernatural ability to read the emotional climate in each household. At his mother's home, he learned to move carefully, avoiding mention of his father unless the conversational moment felt absolutely safe. At his father's place, he sometimes exaggerated his academic achievements, hoping these accomplishments might somehow compensate for the guilt his dad seemed to carry about not being present every single day. This heightened sensitivity to emotional undercurrents represents a double-edged psychological development. While children of divorce often become remarkably empathetic and emotionally intelligent adults, skilled at reading between the lines and understanding unspoken feelings, they also may develop what researchers call hypervigilance, constantly scanning their environment for signs of impending conflict or abandonment. Imagine the long-term impact of growing up with the fundamental belief that peace is fragile, that love comes with conditions, and that stability can vanish overnight without warning. These core beliefs don't just shape how children view their parents, they fundamentally alter how they perceive themselves and their place in the world. Yet here lies one of the most fascinating paradoxes in divorce psychology. Many children from divorced families eventually become extraordinarily resilient adults. The very experiences that initially seem to fracture their foundation often force them to develop remarkable adaptability, teaching them to navigate complexity, juggle multiple realities, and hold contradictions without completely falling apart. Larry, for instance, evolved into the kind of teenager who could offer comfort to struggling friends with wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. His own experience of holding unspoken pain had taught him to recognize and respond to similar suffering in others. This emotional intelligence, born from personal hardship, became one of his greatest strengths. However, resilience doesn't automatically erase the deeper questions that continue to simmer beneath the surface. Children like Larry often wrestle with fundamental concerns about permanence in relationships. If his own parents, two people who presumably loved each other deeply enough to marry and have children, couldn't make their relationship work, what hope existed for lasting love in his own future? These existential questions don't always surface immediately. Sometimes they remain dormant for years, only emerging during young adulthood, when Larry finds himself sitting across from someone he cares about deeply, suddenly overwhelmed by the fear of repeating his parents' pattern. But this is precisely where psychological research offers genuine hope. Studies consistently demonstrate that awareness can break generational cycles. Children who grow up in divorced households aren't destined to repeat identical patterns in their own relationships. In fact, many of them, once they've processed and understood their past experiences, become deeply committed to creating stable, healthy partnerships. Their childhood experiences taught them the genuine value of communication and the devastating cost of silence. They understand intuitively that love, to survive and thrive, must be actively nurtured rather than simply assumed or taken for granted. Let's return to Larry as a young child, because this is where the psychological story truly begins to take root. Like many children experiencing parental divorce, he often wondered whether he had somehow caused the separation. This pattern of self-blame is remarkably common, particularly among children under 10 years old, who tend to internalize divorce as something they somehow triggered through their behavior. Perhaps it was because he misbehaved at school, fought with his siblings, or simply wasn't good enough to keep his family together. These thoughts rarely follow logical patterns, but they feel painfully real to the child experiencing them. Larry carried these questions silently for years, until, as a teenager, he finally admitted his fears to a school counselor. The counselor's response was simple yet profoundly healing. You didn't break your family, you were caught in a change you couldn't control. That single moment of truth-telling stayed with Larry, because sometimes healing doesn't require grand gestures or extensive therapy. Sometimes it simply needs someone to name a truth the child couldn't articulate themselves. This topic resonates universally, because you don't need to be a child of divorce to understand the fundamental human experiences it represents. All of us, in various ways, have felt the sting of separation, whether through the loss of a friendship, the fading of a dream, or the gradual drifting apart of people we once held close to our hearts. Larry's story functions as a mirror, reflecting our universal longing for connection and our shared vulnerability when those connections are threatened. At its core, the psychology of divorce reveals a fundamental paradox. Children from divorced families are simultaneously wounded and wise, familiar with instability, yet craving stability, with an intensity others might not fully comprehend. Their caution in relationships, while sometimes limiting, can also fuel a deeper understanding of what makes partnerships truly work. In many ways, this represents the human condition itself. We are all shaped not only by the love we receive, but also by the love we lose, the connections that slip away despite our best efforts to maintain them. Larry's nights were often heavy with questions. Lying in his bed at his father's house, he would stare at the ceiling, wondering if his mother missed him as much as he missed her. Then, returning to his mother's place, he would wonder if his father felt lonely without him there. This quiet sense of being perpetually split in two, belonging everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, represents one of the most profound psychological burdens a child of divorce can carry. Yet this very burden can also become the seed of extraordinary empathy, teaching children to imagine and understand the inner lives of others with remarkable sensitivity. Psychology tells us that children like Larry often become natural bridge builders, learning to connect worlds that don't naturally align, knowing instinctively how to soften difficult conversations, smooth over rough edges, and create peace in fragile situations. This ability represents both a gift and a weight. While it makes them compassionate and skilled at interpersonal relationships, it can also make them afraid of conflict, constantly working to prevent the next potential rupture in their carefully maintained connections. But what if this tendency, this deep longing to bridge divides, could be transformed from merely a scar into a genuine source of strength? The psychology of children from divorced families isn't a prophecy of permanent brokenness. It's an invitation to resilience, reflection, and the conscious rewriting of what love and commitment truly mean. By the time Larry reached adulthood, he carried both wounds and wisdom in equal measure. Yes, he had trust issues, but he also possessed remarkable insight into human nature. Yes, he sometimes feared abandonment, but he also understood the precious nature of presence and commitment. Above all, he carried a quiet determination. If love is indeed fragile, then he would treat it as precious rather than disposable. This is where the real story begins, because the psychology of children like Larry isn't ultimately about what they endure, it's about what they create from that endurance, how they transform their deepest wounds into sources of strength and connection. Larry once confided to a friend, almost whispering the words as if afraid of their power, "I feel like I belong everywhere and nowhere." This sentence captures the essence of many children with divorced parents. They become children of two homes, yet sometimes it feels like they are children of none, always packing, always moving, always balancing between different worlds. While adults typically view this as a logistical matter involving drop-offs, pickups, and scheduling coordination, for the child it represents something far more symbolic. Home itself becomes a shifting, fluid concept rather than a stable foundation. Psychologists term this dual identity strain, the psychological tension of constantly adapting to two different environments, with different rules, different emotional climates, and sometimes even different value systems. Larry's father maintained strict bedtime rules. His mother was more flexible. His father emphasized sports and competition. His mother encouraged reading and creative expression. To survive and thrive, Larry became emotionally chameleon-like, learning to adjust his personality and behavior quickly depending on his environment. On the surface, this adaptability served him well, making him flexible and socially skilled. But internally, he sometimes wondered about his authentic self. Which version of me represents who I really am? This search for genuine identity represents one of the deepest psychological threads woven throughout the story of a child navigating parental divorce. When external stability becomes divided, the developing self can feel fragmented as well. Yet through this very struggle, many children eventually develop a uniquely strong and integrated sense of identity. As they mature, they learn to combine the lessons from both worlds, drawing strength from contrast rather than being torn apart by it. Consider the psychological richness of a child who witnesses two different perspectives on life, two distinct approaches to love, two separate ways of solving problems. Such a child develops a wider lens through which to view the world. Larry learned discipline and structure from his father, compassion and flexibility from his mother. Initially, these felt like contradictory forces. Eventually, they became integrated strengths that shaped his character. But the journey wasn't always smooth. There were years when Larry feared romantic relationships altogether. He noticed how quickly small arguments between partners reminded him of his parents' gradual drift towards silence and separation. Sometimes he would end promising relationships prematurely, not because he didn't care deeply, but precisely because he cared too much to risk experiencing that kind of loss again. His psychological makeup carried a subtle but powerful undercurrent. Better to leave before they leave you. This defensive stance is remarkably common among adult children of divorce. Research indicates they may be slightly more likely to struggle with commitment or trust issues in early adulthood, not because they don't desire love, but because they've witnessed firsthand how fragile it can be. Yet, as Larry eventually discovered, fragility doesn't equal futility. A glass may be delicate, but it can still hold water when handled with care. Love may be vulnerable, but it can endure when nurtured with awareness, intention, and mutual commitment. What does this kind of awareness look like in practice? For Larry, it began with recognizing patterns in his own behavior. He realized he was constantly anticipating rejection, always testing people's patience to see if they would stay when things became difficult. Once he understood this dynamic, he could begin to shift it. He came to understand that trust isn't about receiving guarantees. It's about choosing vulnerability even when the outcome remains uncertain. This insight transforms psychology into philosophy. The child of divorce who has seen promises break often becomes the adult who learns to honor commitments more deeply and intentionally. Research reveals both risk factors and remarkable strengths among children from divorced families. On the risk side, they may experience temporary decreases in academic performance, higher rates of anxiety or self-doubt, and initial difficulty forming stable attachments. But the strength side of the equation is equally compelling. They often develop exceptional empathy, advanced problem-solving skills, and remarkable adaptability. Many are described as old souls because they learn early that life exists in shades of gray rather than black and white absolutes. Here's a powerful truth. Resilience doesn't grow in comfort. It develops in the cracks, in the spaces where life challenges us to adapt and overcome. Larry's emotional cracks taught him to listen deeply to others, to notice when someone was hurting even when they remained silent. His own childhood experience of carrying unspoken pain had trained him to hear what wasn't being said. Yet empathy alone wasn't sufficient for his healing journey. There came a crucial time when Larry had to directly face his inner child, the boy who still wondered if he was somehow responsible for his parents' divorce. Professional therapy helped, honest conversations with trusted friends helped, but most importantly, time and maturity helped him reach a life-changing realization. Divorce wasn't his story. It was the story of two adults navigating their own human imperfections, relationship challenges, and personal growth. He wasn't the cause of their separation. He was simply a witness to their journey. This understanding proved critical, because children who carry misplaced guilt often grow into adults who overcompensate, constantly trying to fix situations, please everyone, and prevent conflict at any cost. When they finally grasp that they were never responsible for their parents' choices, they discover a profound freedom. And freedom gives birth to authenticity. The ability to show up as their genuine selves rather than constantly performing to prevent abandonment. Larry eventually fell deeply in love, and yes, the familiar fears resurfaced with surprising intensity. He worried about repeating generational patterns, about promises fading into the kind of silence he remembered from his childhood. But this time he chose a different path. Instead of hiding his fears or ending the relationship preemptively, he spoke his truth. He shared with his partner the nights spent moving between homes, the loyalty conflicts that had shaped his childhood, the questions he still carried about love and permanence. Something beautiful and transformative happened. Instead of running away, his partner listened with compassion and understanding. In that sacred space of being heard and accepted, a new pattern began to emerge. This represents perhaps the deepest gift children of divorce can offer the world. Radical honesty. They understand the devastating cost of silence, so they learn to value speaking difficult truths. They know the weight of unresolved emotional loops, so they become storytellers who actively seek closure and healing. In psychological terms, they embody what researchers call post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where hardship, instead of merely breaking someone, actually deepens their capacity for meaning, connection, and purpose. Their wounds become sources of wisdom, rather than permanent limitations. Let's return one final time to the image of young Larry lying in bed, wondering whether love can truly last. That fundamental question never completely disappears, but it undergoes a profound transformation. Perhaps the question shifts from does love last forever, to can I love fully while it lasts? And isn't that, in many ways, the essential question for all of us? Whether our parents stayed together or divorced, whether our lives unfolded smoothly or with dramatic fractures, we all carry the universal longing to be loved and the natural fear of losing those connections. Larry's story represents the journey of fragility, becoming wisdom, teaching us that a child of divorce isn't defined by brokenness, but by the depth of their understanding about human relationships. Yes, they may wrestle with doubts that others don't face. Yes, they may carry emotional scars that influence their choices. But those very scars can become detailed maps, guides toward deeper empathy, stronger commitment, and the conscious building of the kinds of relationships they once feared might not be possible. Maybe that's the secret gift hidden within the pain. Children of divorce often mature into adults who understand something profound about love's true nature. They know love isn't guaranteed, which makes it sacred. They understand stability isn't promised, which makes it worth protecting with intention and effort. When they choose to love, they do so with eyes wide open, not out of naive certainty, but from a place of conscious devotion. They commit, not because it's easy or natural, but because they understand intimately what it means when commitment fades and promises break. So when you think of Larry, don't only picture the confused boy at the dinner table, struggling to understand the silence between his parents. Picture also the man he became, someone who knows how precious presence truly is, who listens with extraordinary depth, who commits not despite life's fragility, but because of it. The psychology of a divorced parent's child isn't ultimately a tragedy, it's a profound lesson written in human hearts and lived experiences. It teaches us that from division can come unity, from fragility can emerge strength, and from silence can rise a powerful voice of truth and healing. Perhaps children like Larry remind all of us of a truth we sometimes forget in our quest for perfect relationships. Love isn't about achieving perfection, it's about choosing each other again and again, especially when things feel fragile, especially when commitment requires conscious effort rather than effortless ease. Their stories whisper a powerful message that our deepest wounds, when faced with courage and given time to heal, can become our greatest sources of strength, wisdom, and connection to others, who are also learning what it means to love and be loved in an imperfect, beautiful, fragile world.